Most people will find, listen, and subscribe to your podcast in an app of some sort. And while there are hundreds of podcast listening apps available, there are only a few key podcast directories that you need to make sure you submit your podcast to in order to get into most of them. And those three are Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. So in this video, we're going to walk through the step-by-step instructions that you need in order to submit your podcast to those three directories. And we're going to show you how to do it whether you host your podcast through Buzzsprout or if you host it with somebody else. All right, so I'm going to show you how to submit your podcast to Apple Podcasts within Buzzsprout, but this process will work no matter what kind of podcast hosting company that you are using. So just keep that in mind. And as I show you what's in the Buzzsprout dashboard, you'll just do the subsequent steps or the similar steps in your own podcast host. But before we can submit Pod Talk, our brand new podcast, to Apple Podcasts, there's a couple fields that Apple will need, all right? And so if I go over to podcast settings, you will see the required fields that Apple's looking for. Number one, you have to have your podcast title. You need to have a podcast description or summary describing your podcast. You'll need custom artwork for your podcast. You can't use the generic template artwork that your host might provide. And the typical rule of thumb is to use a 3000 by 3000 pixel artwork file. Apple will also need at least one category in order to organize your podcast within their directory. The first category is what they use for their list rankings. So if you think about the education category, which is what we've have chosen for Pod Talk, or true crime, or fiction, or sports, whatever your podcast category is, the main one that best describes your podcast, that's what you want to put here. And you can choose up to 3, but you need at least 1. You also need this artist field filled out. This is the podcast host. So if you're hosting your own show, you'll put your name here. And then just some other details. Do you want all of your episodes listed or just a few episodes listed? What kind of podcast do you have? An episodic podcast or a serial podcast? The language that you speak for the majority of your podcast, website, contact email, those kinds of things. So you will need these details in your RSS feed saved to your podcast before you can submit your podcast to Apple Podcasts. But once you've done that, then in Buzzsprout, all you would do is go to our Directories tab and then under Apple Podcasts, click Get Listed. And then one last thing that you'll need before you can submit your podcast to Apple Podcasts is an Apple ID. So this is a login that gets you into the Apple suite of products. Even if you don't use any Apple devices, even if you have an Android phone and use a Windows laptop, you still need to have an Apple ID in order to submit your podcast to Apple Podcasts. But if you just Google how to create an Apple ID, there's a lot of articles that can help you do that. But once you have all of that set up, then you can click this button to submit to Apple Podcasts. Now, if you're coming from a different podcast hosting platform and you don't have that fancy button, you'll just want to Google Podcast Connect, and that will send you to this website here. I know it says iTunes Connect up in the top left corner. I figured eventually Apple will fix that, but for now, this is what it says. And you're just going to log in with that Apple ID that you have set up. So I'm going to log in here. And if you do this through Buzzsprout, you can see that we went ahead and pulled all of your information into Apple Podcasts for you. If your podcast host doesn't do this, all you would have to do is find your RSS feed and put it into this field, and then you're going to go up to here and click Validate. And that Validate button just lets Apple double check all of your data, look through your RSS feed, which is how Apple Podcasts is going to pull new episodes in automatically, just to make sure there's nothing missing, there's nothing that's mislabeled or anything like that. The connection is completely stable before they list your show in Apple Podcasts. But once everything looks good, you've validated your RSS feed, all you have to do is click Submit. And so here you can see that our podcast was successfully submitted for review. And then once Apple has either accepted the podcast or rejected the podcast, you will get an email letting you know. If your podcast gets rejected, they will typically tell you why, whether that's an artwork file that didn't meet their specifications, or if they didn't like the title for some reason, or if there's something wrong with your episodes. They will give you those details in that email, and then you can just forward that to your podcast host's support team If you use Buzzsprout, you would just forward it to support@buzzsprout.com, and they'd be able to help walk you through any changes you need to make to your RSS feed in order to get your podcast listed in Apple Podcasts. Now, if you're using Buzzsprout to host your podcast, there's one last thing that will help us help you and get your link in your custom website. So once you've gone through the process of submitting your podcast to Apple Podcasts, go ahead and click this button that says I've submitted to Apple Podcasts. And so what that does is it allows us to check periodically to see when your podcast has been listed in Apple Podcasts. And when it is, we will pull your custom Apple Podcasts URL and put it in here for you to be able to copy and paste if you want to share it with somebody. If you wanted to create a custom button on your website, we would keep that URL here for you for your convenience. Typically, it only takes a few days to find out if your show was accepted into Apple Podcasts, but it can take up to 10 business days. So be patient. Apple Podcasts typically takes a little bit longer to approve podcasts, but considering it's the largest directory in the world and more people listen to podcasts in Apple Podcasts than any other app, it's definitely a directory that you need to be in. All right, guys, so let's go ahead and get a podcast listed in Spotify. Now, there's two ways to do this. If you host with Buzzsprout, we have a simpler way of getting your podcast in Spotify. But then Spotify has its own process. So if you are hosting your own podcast with Amazon Web Services or something like that, or you're using a host that doesn't have an API connection to Spotify, you can use this method that I'm about to show you. But before you get started, you have to have certain things set up in your podcast in order for Spotify to bring it into their directory. The first thing you need is an episode that has been published. So here you can see I created this little trailer for this imaginary podcast, and it's been published. But once you have all of those things ready to go, you get your first episode out there and all your podcast settings set up, let's go ahead and get listed in Spotify. So you're going to go to this website, podcasters.spotify.com, and here you're going to get started. So you click on the Get Started button. If you do not have a Spotify account yet, you can set one up. They're free to set up, or you can use this login with Facebook button, whichever one is more convenient for you to get started. So once you log into Spotify, either with your Facebook account or by creating a Spotify account, you're going to see this screen. If it doesn't show up, then you want to go over here to the toolbar and click on Add Your Podcast. But here you're going to see that Spotify is going to need your RSS feed, so make sure that you have that readily available. And then once you have your podcast submitted into Spotify and it's starting to get play data, there's actually a way for you to monitor that Spotify data and all your stats and things like that as well. But we're going to click Get Started so we can get started. So here, Spotify is asking for the RSS feed for your podcast. And so if I go back to Buzzsprout and go over to Directories and click on RSS feed, that's where I can find the RSS feed for Pod Talk, for this podcast that I've created. So wherever your RSS feed is in your podcast host, this is what it needs to look like. It should be something like this, a web address with .rss at the end. So I'm just going to copy that, go back to Spotify, and I'm going to paste it into here. So Spotify was able to pull all of the data that we put in there, right? So they have the artwork, the title of the podcast, the artist for the podcast, and then the description and the category. So all the things that we needed, Spotify was able to retrieve. So now, if this all looks good, we're going to click Next. So now, Spotify is going to verify that you own this podcast. So this is the email that is associated with your podcast. So remember, in the podcast settings, there's a contact email in your settings. That's the email that Spotify pulled through your RSS feed. And so you'll need to send a code to your email address to verify that you actually own this email address and you're not just trying to claim somebody else's podcast. So we'll click Send Code. And then once I get that email with the code, I'll verify my email address and we'll keep moving forward. So Spotify sent me the verification code basically immediately. I was able to copy and paste it into this field and then said, yeah, you're verified. Let's continue. So we're going to keep going here. So Spotify here wants to know a little bit more about your podcast. So you're just going to fill out each of these fields, whatever they ask for. So I'm in the United States. The primary language is English. Hosting provider is Buzzsprout. And then primary category is educational. All right. So these are the categories that Spotify is going to use. And so in addition to that, you can also select 3 subcategories. So we're going to do how to and more educational. Those are the 2 that really make more sense. So once you have those filled out, you're going to click next. And then Spotify is going to ask you if everything looks okay. All those fields you just filled out, is that what you want? If you want to fix something, you can click go back and adjust one of these fields, but everything looks good to me. So I'm going to hit submit. And now Spotify has Pod Talk listed. Now, they do say that it'll take a few hours for the podcast to show up on Spotify, but the confetti is falling. We can celebrate. Pod Talk has been successfully submitted into Spotify. So regardless of the podcast host that you're using for your podcast, this process will work for you. Now, if you host with Buzzsprout, all you have to do is go to Directories, and then in Spotify, click Get Listed. Here, we're going to prompt you to make sure that you have all of those things identified that we talked about at the beginning of this video, right? At least one live episode, the title, description, artwork, etc. And then you just click this button to submit your podcast to Spotify. And then that's all you got to do. You don't have to go through that whole process we went through. Just make sure all those things are filled out, ready to go, and then click submit to Spotify, and we will take care of the rest for you. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to submit your podcast to Google Podcasts through Google Podcasts Manager. It's a brand new process for submitting your podcast to Google Podcasts that works a lot faster than the old way. And I'm going to show you how to do it inside of Buzzsprout, but this is something you can do regardless of where you host your podcast. So if you're in your Buzzsprout account and you go to the Directories tab, you'll see Google Podcasts here on the right. And here, there are just some simple instructions for the things that you need to have already in your podcast feed. So the name of your podcast, the description of your podcast, an artwork file, a category, the primary language, English, Spanish, German, something like that, and then marked explicit or not explicit. You will need this RSS feed URL when you submit your podcast to Google. So go ahead and click copy to copy it to your clipboard, and then click this button down here to go to the Google Podcast Manager website. And if you use a podcast host other than Buzzsprout, I'll leave a link to this website in the YouTube video description. So you can just click on that and follow along. But we're going to go ahead and go over to Google Podcast Manager. So once you log into one of your Google accounts, probably the one that is associated with your podcast would be the best. You're going to go through this 4-step process to submit your podcast to Google Podcasts through their manager website. So the first step here is to paste that RSS feed that we just copied and click next step. And then here, Google is going to pull in your podcast. So you'll be able to review the artwork, the title, the description for your podcast, and your most recent episodes. So if everything looks good, then you know Google has pulled your podcast in successfully. And if you need to make any changes, then you'll want to go back to your podcast host, make sure that everything is exactly the way that you want it to be, and then continue by clicking next step. Now here, Google is going to send a verification code to the email that's in your RSS feed. So this email is the one that in Buzzsprout is saved in the podcast settings. Obviously, this isn't a real email address, but your real email address would be featured right there. So when you want to verify your podcast, all you have to do is click this send code, and it will send a unique code to that email address. So we'll click send code, and then check your inbox for that email from Google Podcasts with that verification code. You're going to copy it right here and then hit submit. And that's all you have to do. Now, it can take Google up to 2 weeks to approve new podcasts. So what you'll want to do if you use Buzzsprout is go back to your Buzzsprout dashboard. And then down here at step 4, you can click this button to check and see if Google Podcasts has approved your podcast submission. All right. And so you can check back periodically until Buzzsprout can confirm that Google Podcasts not only has your podcast, but has listed it in their app. And then you'll also be able to get the link to that for when you share it on social media or on your website. So now you know how to get your show listed in the top 3 directories to really maximize your podcast's potential. Now, if you're an independent podcaster that's always on the lookout for what is currently working in the world of podcasting, make sure you subscribe to the Buzzsprout YouTube channel, because every single week we put out multiple videos covering everything from podcast gear and equipment to software tutorials to strategy videos like you just watched. So if this video is helpful for you, make sure that you subscribe to the channel. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. And as always, keep podcasting.